The last time there was a meeting this highly anticipated between the leaders of the United States and Russia, President Trump set off an earthquake with what he said as he stood shoulder to shoulder with the Russian president after they had emerged from hours behind closed doors in Helsinki. But this time here in Anchorage at this hastily arranged summit in Alaska, the major fallout tonight is because of what wasn't said.
I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Ratcliffe, thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job.
The president there mentioning several of his senior staff, but no mention of a ceasefire or severe sanctions that he had promised if things didn't go the way he had expected them to today. So what exactly did happen in that room is something that we are starting to piece together tonight as the president, for his part, tried to spin it the best he could.
I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. But we had an extremely productive meeting and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant. But we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there.
The president making clear there that no deal with Putin was reached on a ceasefire. And he just left Anchorage a few moments ago without what he had wanted in hand there. This day began with plenty of pomp and somewhat awkward circumstances as American service members who were in uniform quite literally rolled out the red carpet for someone who for years has been a global pariah. President Trump was greeting President Putin with a hearty handshake and a ride to the meeting in the Beast. Just the two of them, as you can see here. That was apparently the only time it was just the two of them together. There was about 10 minutes or so from what we judged from when they got in the car to when they got out. And then that came after the United States changed things up at the last minute to the schedule. What was expected to be a one-on-one that included two advisors each in the room, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in there with the U.S. President. The two leaders were here on the ground for about a total of 6 hours, and the Russian leader seemed quite happy to keep kicking the can down the road when it comes to getting a peace deal in Ukraine. As he mentioned, his long-serving grievances that he has had when it comes to his war in Ukraine. And at the end, he said he had an idea for the next meeting that he could have with President Trump.
So, again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much. And we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening.
My lead sources are here to start me off tonight in Anchorage. CNN Chief National Security Analyst Jim Sciutto is here. Also, former CNN Moscow Bureau Chief Jill Dougherty is joining us. And Jill, I'll get to you because I can't wait to hear your thoughts on what you saw playing out. But Jim, watching that and listening to that, I mean, we were in the room. There was this sense of anticipation because they moved us pretty quickly to our seats. And then as both of them had pretty short remarks, which, as you know, is not typical for either of them, we were prepared to take questions. We were standing up, shouting questions, and Trump then turned and left the stage with Putin. I wonder what that says to you.
Well, listen, by President Trump's own measure of success for this summit, it was a failure because he wanted a ceasefire. He didn't get a ceasefire, didn't announce it there. Is it possible over the next several days, weeks, we see one? Yes, but he didn't get it in this meeting. No one begrudges his efforts to do so, the least of whom the Ukrainian people who are desperate for peace, right, to end the onslaught they've been suffering through these years. But he didn't, in this moment, move President Putin off his core interests and demands by force of personality and presence alone, which seemed to be Trump's calculation going into this, that if I could just get into a room with him face to face, I can bring us to a deal. And that didn't work in the moment. And you heard that in President Putin's comments prior to President Trump speaking, repeating these phrases we've heard from the beginning. One, address the root causes of the war.
Yeah, the second he said root causes.
It's code for it's your fault I invaded, right? I invaded with justification, threat from the West, NATO, etc. And the other familiar phrase is addressed core interests of Russia, core national security interests. And again, by his judgment, that is an independent, free, westward-leaning Ukraine is a threat to Russia, and he doesn't want that to happen. So.
And there was a comment that he made about basically hoping European leaders don't torpedo whatever it is that they agreed to. I mean, they never really laid out what it was. But clearly, I'm assuming by that it crosses some red lines that European leaders have.
Exactly. Now, I will say that the fear I heard from European officials prior to this meeting was that Trump might make a deal over Ukraine's head and over Europe's head, right? Might agree to something that they weren't comfortable with, and that didn't happen. And Trump did say, I'm going to check in with my allies at NATO and with the Ukrainian president. And he did say as well that no land swaps are going to happen without Ukraine, in effect, approving that decision. So the worst fears of many on that side of the Atlantic did not come out, but the president's hopes certainly were not realized either.
Jill Doherty, you're our former Moscow bureau chief. How do you think Putin's leaving this meeting feeling? What are the Russians talking about on their flight back right now, do you think?
Well, I mean, he leaves a happy man. Things look good. The pomp and circumstance that you referred to, the Russians love it. I think they're perceiving this as a win for Mr. Putin. There were a couple of hints, though, I think, when you get into the substance as opposed to the cosmetics. He did talk about root causes, and no question, and that is a red flag. But there were a couple of kind of cryptic comments about working on security issues. Not quite sure exactly what he meant. And if I heard him correctly, he talked about not throwing a wrench into anything. So there may be something in that, you know, if you put that together with the Europeans are supposed to, as kind of the coalition of the willing, provide some type of forces that would be kind of peacekeepers or at least minders. And I don't know, we'll have to hear the details. But overall, I think Putin came here and got exactly what he wanted, which is kicking the can down the road, no real definition, and really not changing that root cause that he constantly talks about.
Yeah, Jill Doherty, Jim Sciutto, thank you for that expert analysis. I also want to check in Ukraine. That's where CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh is live in Kyiv right now. Obviously, you know, Nick, we were leaving the military base where Trump and Putin met just a few moments ago. We watched Putin take off, and then we watched Air Force One take off. I mean, presumably Trump is calling Zelensky from this flight back to Washington. But have you heard any reaction there so far to what they made of today's summit and how abruptly it ended?
No, I mean, obviously it's incredibly late here, but at the same time, utter silence. You may imagine that call could potentially happen later. Look, I think it's important to remember some of the things Trump said seem to suggest that there was an element of a deal or some kind of idea that he had to put to Zelensky, because he said it's going to be up to Zelensky how he feels about that, and something he also needed to explain to the Europeans. But you could just tell from his posture, his gestures, he didn't think he was going to see much success there. So it feels to me potentially like Putin may have suggested some sort of proposal, some kind of peace idea that Trump immediately knew wasn't going to get off the ground at all. We'll probably hear more details about that tomorrow. That may also explain Putin's sort of slightly threatening comments of making sure that Europe didn't get in the way of progress on this particular front. But look, there's one big victory for Putin here, outside of the clear rehabilitation on the world stage, that made many Ukrainians grimace as they saw him being given a red carpet welcome, sitting side by side inside the beast with President Trump. And that's time. Now, I can't stress how significant it is if Putin is able to find himself another month or two to stave off secondary sanctions that clearly had an impact on Moscow's thinking after the Indians and the Chinese rang Putin ahead of those sanctions potentially coming into play, and then he agreed to this bilateral meeting. Time is important day by day, and that's the pace at which villages are changing hands. Places, you've never heard of, but slowly the more of them that fall to Russia, the more potential there is for a strategic change along the front line. And so the Donetsk region, which many felt was something Steve Witkoff, US Special Envoy, was told by the Kremlin that they wanted to see Ukraine voluntarily withdraw from for a ceasefire. Well, week by week, that's increasingly in Russian hands. We're unclear when the tipping point's going to be, but there are a number of key towns along the front line that are under intense Russian pressure right now. He may only need till the end of September or early October to make wider effect here, some of his military advances, and he certainly seems to have bought himself more time here, Caitlin.